The Russians massively outnumber the Ukrainians. And they have a lot more men to lose, and they have a lot higher tolerance for casualties. So the 2 or 3 to 1 ratio that the Ukrainians have been inflicting on the Russians in terms of casualty ratios is wildly insufficient if the Ukrainians are going to win. They need to achieve a series of mass fatality events that kills at least minimum 500,000 Russian troops in a very short period of time. That is very difficult to do. They also, because of the numbers disconnect, can only win if they win on quality and above all mobility. And by the time we get to May 1, which will be spring and mud season will be over, the Ukrainians will have more troops with more training and better equipment, but the Russians will have thrown an extra 500,000 men into the fight. So we're going to find out very, very soon, certainly before the end of June, which of these battle strategies is going to be more effective. And the numbers absolutely favor the Russians, because remember, unless the Ukrainians can inflict 8 to 1 casualty ratios, they still lose. But if they can pull that off and completely break Russian military power, then it's game on. We will know by mid-June just who's going to win this war. Now, step 2, the impact that this has on all those economic issues you were bringing up. The Russians are a major producer or processor of any number of industrial and agricultural materials that just don't have good substitutes anywhere. On the agricultural front, potash is the most important one. In terms of industry, I'd say chromium and nickel are probably near the top because you can't make steel without them. All of this stuff has been maintained, all this infrastructure has been maintained not by the Russians, but by Westerners who are no longer there. A lot of the industrial infrastructure dates back to the 60s, and we are already seeing industrial accidents that are so big that they can't be seen from orbit. They can be detected from orbit because the explosions are so big. It's happening in energy and natural gas. It's happening in agricultural production. It's happening in chemicals. So whether it happens in 3 months or 3 years, we need to count on most of the industrial materials that the Russians send to the rest of the world going away, regardless of who wins this war. And that makes a lot of things very difficult for a lot of other players. The Russians don't know how to fight. It's not that they've forgotten the lessons of the Soviet period. They've forgotten the lessons of the Tsar. They're almost starting from scratch. And if you put NATO up against the Russians directly, you're going to get 1,000 to 1 casualty ratios. And that made no one happy, because if the Russians can win in Ukraine, we know they're coming for Poland and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Romania, and those are NATO countries. If Ukraine loses and we get that head-to-head Russian-NATO fight, we know we will wipe the floor with them. But the Russians see this as a fight for their existential existence. And they will use every card they have. There have not been protests in Russia, not just because the propaganda has dug into the Russians.
He has more support than the West thinks he does.
A lot more. There's not a challenge to him from within. And if you think back to the first mobilization, 1 million men fled the country. There were no protests. The Russians are broadly in favor of the war. They would just prefer not to fight in it. The territory that they live in from Central Europe out into Siberia is some of the world's worst farmland. You can grow 1 crop of short season wheat and that's about it. So the Russians have never been able to have a national road network. They've never had the money. Everything has to be moved by rail. And so their forces move very, very slowly. They have to literally walk places. And if you look at the area around where they live, there are a lot of open territories that are useless. They're near desert, they're near Arctic. And then beyond that are some actual barriers, places where there are deserts or seas or mountains. So the Russian strategy going back over 3 centuries has been to advance out of their kind of crappy land, through the really crappy land on their shoulders, and then get to those geographic barriers where you can't run a panzer division through it. And then they forward position those very, very slow-moving troops on the access points between those barriers. Unfortunately for Ukraine, they're not in those barriers, but they're on the way to 2 of them. So from the Russian point of view, what's going on in Ukraine is like phase 5 of an 8-part plan. The Russians have done this multiple times in other countries in the former Soviet world since 1992. And if they succeed in Ukraine, they will push on. And the next line of countries that would allow them to actually control those access points include Romania and Poland, both of which are NATO countries. You can see how seriously the Russians took it. Anytime people are talking about security guarantees for the Russians, you know that they've bought into the Russian propaganda. Keep in mind that when this war started, you already had several percentage of Ukraine's territory that was already under Russian occupation from the last war.
Crimea.
Yeah, Crimea, the Donbass. This is the 7th time that Putin has done this since 1999 in the former Soviet world. He's going to keep pushing until he gets to an outer perimeter that he thinks is more securable. Russian territory is just really poor economically. It's some of the poorest land in the world for anything. And they've never had enough money to generate a road network. So what they do is they expand out until they reach zones that they can defend. Because think about Napoleon or Hitler. You know, they rolled into the Russian interior, and it wasn't the Russians who defeated them, it was the weather. The only way that the Russians have ever discovered that they can be safe is if they can plug the access points that allow countries to get into their space in the first place. That's Poland, that's Romania. So the question was never, will the Russians stop before they get all of Ukraine? No, it's like, what will they go for after they've taken all of Ukraine? There's a lot of details that have to be worked out between today and then, because obviously first they have to beat the Ukrainians. It's in play. I can't predict where the war is going to go. The first year of every Russian war looks just like this one. It's a shit show. And then the Russians throw 1 million men at it and the math changes. We haven't had that change yet. Until such time that the Russians can regain the strategic initiative, and it's possible that they won't, their best play is to make Ukraine utterly uninhabitable. Well, this is their last real conventional war. They only have those 8 million men of the appropriate age. And if they are fighting or dying, they are not having kids. And Russia is already the second worst demographic structure in the world after China. The first 7 times that he did things like this, the world handed him exactly what he was after. This is the first time that people have pushed back. For the Russians, I don't think it's possible. There is no way to have a Russia that is secure and to have Russian neighbors that are secure. And the Americans have already chosen to ally with most of the neighbors, even before the Ukraine war started. The Russians will probably disassociate into 30 or 35 warring principalities that will just kind of become not so much a no man's land, but a shifting feudal conflict zone.
Post-Soviet Russia went from 9 to 1. And most of what Russia has done during the Putin government has been about getting troops into those gaps. So this is the Kazakh police intervention. This is the Crimean War. This is the Georgian War. They now have 5 of them. And if they can grab Ukraine in its entirety, they will be one step away from having 7. Post-Soviet collapse in the 1990s, there was a baby bust, and there are less than half the number of people in their 20s today compared to people who are in their 30s today. Now, you'll notice that it kind of rounds out a little bit below, suggesting that maybe their demographic situation is a little bit better in the future. But the Russians literally just found 8 million children about 7 years ago and threw them into the data. They weren't there the day before. So honestly, that gap probably then goes straight down. So the Russians are literally running out of people to do this. And if they didn't do it now, it was never going to happen. Now, a lot of people are like, why would the Russians be so paranoid? Why would the Russians feel that they had to do it now? It's really simple. They believe, accurately in my mind, that if they can't forward position to these gateways now, they will lose the capacity in the future. And the next time there's a real war of invasion, they will be fighting in an area where they have to defend a huge amount of territory and they can't concentrate any of their defenses. And that is a recipe for death, because Russia doesn't have a bottomless population now.